How different is Japanese armor from Chinese armor? Well, there is a huge amount of variation in both. After all, we are talking about millennia of warfare. So on this video we're going to divide them by category, starting with leather armor. In China, leather was used, as it was used in Japan, to make armor. We know a lot more about how the Chinese made leather armor compared to how the Japanese did in the earlier periods, because the Chinese developed writing in the Bronze Age, thousands of years before the Japanese, who only started to become literate importing the Chinese writing in the 4th century AD. There were two kinds of leather armor in China, the coat of leather and the leather scale armor. When producing any of these, the hide from the rhinos was favored. One horned rhino's hide armor would consist of 6 layers. Armor made with the hide from 2 horned rhinos would be up to 7 layers, while a mix of the two types would only need 5 layers. This kind of armor would protect the torso. It would be sleeveless and it would open at the front. In the Tang period, or Tang Chao, rhinoceros hide armor was still in use, and subsequently red leather armor became typical. When rhinoceros hide became scarce, buffalo skin was used. Mentions of shark skin armor are present in literary sources, although it is unclear if the whole armor was made of many layers of shark skin or if the armor would be conventional rhino's hide with only the last layer being shark skin for cosmetic purposes. In Japan, leather was also used to make armor and armor parts, called nerigawa. Most likely, the first prehistorical armors that were used by early Japanese warriors before metal working was discovered were made of hide, but unfortunately we don't have any remains. But when looking at samurai history, so starting in the Heian period when leather was used to make scales, then we know that they were lacquered for protection and waterproof to prevent softening to long exposure to the wet. Even when metal lamellae were used, leather strips were initially used to lace them together, and we can see this with the proto-historic Iron Age Japanese armor. At this time they would use leather to fasten the front opening, while cotton was used to secure shoulder plates in place. Leather thongs would be discarded and silk would be used for lacing, because differently from leather, silk wouldn't harden after wetting. Leather was used to produce helmet lining and sometimes covering for iron-plated armor. Lamellar armor was a very effective and flexible kind of body protection made of hundreds of relatively small plates of leather, copper, bronze or iron, called lamellae, pierced with holes at top, sides and bottom for lacing, usually overlapping each other upwards, although sometimes the lapping was minimal or non-present. True lamellar doesn't require any fabric or leather backing, which is the actual most prominent distinguishing feature. In ancient China, lamellar armor was a staple, and it was made both with leather lamellae, which would then be lacquered, sometimes red and gold, or metal lamellae, being made of highly polished copper, bronze or iron, and in later periods, steel. Excavations from the fortified Han watchtowers have provided several lamellae of both types, issued for the armor of the frontier guards. In this specific finding, rectangular lamellae were predominant, but other shapes also existed. It is in fact in the 1st century of our era, during the Han dynasty, or Han Chao, that Chinese infantry and cavalry armor changed from coats of hide to lamellar and scale armor. As we can clearly see from the figurines of warriors and soldiers of this era, there were several types of lamellar cuirasses, some short from shoulder to waist, joined over the shoulder by narrow straps, some skirted, which would cover also the legs of the wearer. Horse armor would also be lamellar at this time. When present, lamellar shoulder guards are shown connected to a collar worn beneath the cuirass, similarly to European gorget. During the Tang dynasty, armor would often be made of a combination of types, scale, leather and lamellar being mixed to form one sort of armor. Also a characteristic of Tang warrior figurines is that often the armor of such warriors is shown covered by fabric, similarly to the high medieval fashion in Europe to wear fabric over armor. In 1374, all armor was ordered to be laced with leather thongs instead of cords. A very peculiar kind of lamellar armor is the mountain pattern armor, which was made of a series of small plates which resemble the shape of the Chinese character for mountain, interlocking with one another, ultimately forming an intricate protective mesh. References to mountain pattern armor appear as early as the Tang dynasty in the 6 statutes of the Tang dynasty. However, we don't know how it actually worked. There are also no surviving examples. Everything that is known about mountain pattern armor comes from painting and statues, typically from 2 specific dynasties, Song Chao and Ming Chao. Also, it is important to say that mountain pattern armor is not unique to China and has been found in depictions in Korea, Vietnam, Japan and Thailand. The Yamato people, who were the proto-historic Japanese, had knowledge of casting bronze and iron working. It is by the 4th and 5th century AD that we start finding metal cuirasses and helmets in their burial mounds. We know that lamellar armor reached Japan in the 5th century AD from China. The proto-historic coat of Japanese lamellar armor was called keiko and was in use from the 5th century to the 8th. This body armor consisted of a sleeveless jacket opening at the front, with a skirt reaching the upper part of the thighs, and it was mostly intended to be used on horseback. Narrow, concave lamellae were used to produce a very marked waist, typical of this time period in Japan, while cotton shoulder straps were laced to the upper rows of lamellae, both at the front and at the back. The ends of the cotton straps will be tied on the shoulders. Despite its early date, the Keiko was actually a more complex armor design than later models. That's because there could be as many as 6 or more different types and sizes of scales used for one single armor. In the Nara period, both plate armor, which in this case is an early kind of Iron Age armor called tanko, which we will discuss in the plate armor section of this video, and lamella were present. However, after a period of mixed designs, the lamella pattern will prevail. In the early Heian period, armorers started to experiment with a great number of lacing methods and several changes were made. Lamellae started to be gilded. A new version of lamella was made, built up of rectangular lamellae. They would be divided into sections or panels, one for the front and one for the back, connected over the shoulders. The shoulder guards would then be attached to the shoulders with cords. Obviously, the sides would remain open and thus would be defended by 2 separate side pieces tied under the arms and put on before the frontal and back panel. In the 9th century, so the Middle Heian period, we see a distinction between the armor for infantry and the armor for cavalry. The armor for foot soldiers evolved from the lamella coat, while the armor for mounted warriors evolved from the lamella made of separate panels. In the middle to late Heian period, we have the transition to a new version of Japanese lamella. Before the Middle Heian period, armor would be lacquered before lacing, and then the lamellae would be joined into laminations. The new technique consisted of instead lacing them into strips first and then lacquer them heavily. Probably one of the reasons was to make sure that all parts would be lacquered, so including the tough leather rawhide parts, making them also waterproof, avoiding the softening of the leather which would result from exposure to the wet. Also, armor lacing became distinctively Japanese from this time because of the use of dyed stenciled doeskin cut into strips to connect the laminations together. By the late Heian period, lamella armor had received further modification and it had become the well-known oyoroi. Oyoroi is a later name given to the old style of armor. Back in the period in which oyoroi was in use, it would have been just called yoroi. Alternatively, domaru, or body wrap, was a type of chest armor which first started to appear in the 11th century as an armor for lesser samurai and retainers, and it had a more simple construction if compared to the oyoroi worn by the wealthy samurai of high status. The oyoroi was basically a combination. The upper section of an oyoroi would have a solid iron breast section called muna ita, which would be connected to the upper row of lamella torso protection. The shoulder straps that kept the door in place would be made of padded rawhide. The separate right side plate was made of iron and often covered inside and outside with leather. This right section would be put on first, before the rest of the cuirass, which would then embrace the body, forming a C shape. Another close-fitting cuirass similar to the domaru was the haramaki, which opened at the back rather than on the right side. Both haramaki and domaru would have been much lighter than an oyoroi. That's actually one of the reasons why some high-ranking samurai started wearing the much lighter domaru instead of oyoroi from the first part of the 14th century. Mail is a defense made of interlocking metal rings, and it was certainly known by the Chinese. Yet, although occasionally present, mail was never fully adopted by the Chinese army as a main kind of armor. Probably most mail that the Chinese came in contact with would have been of Persian manufacture. One of the earliest mentions of mail in ancient China is as a tribute from Samarkand. During the Tang dynasty, the production of mail existed, and it would have fallen under the manufacture of the imperial armory, but only high-ranking officers would have been fitted with it. There is no mention of mail in the Ming military regulations, and apparently it was already known to the Chinese since they first encountered it in 384 AD. Mail was more of a status symbol in China, and it typically belonged to the high ranks and to the rich who could afford it. Nonetheless, lamella remained the dominant form in the continent. Mail was also present and used in Japan at least since the time of the Mongol invasions in the 1270s. Mail would be used in one or two ways, either as a standalone armor or to close up and reinforce other kinds of armor. The ring of mail would be used to add protection for the sleeves of a samurai suit of armor, or to protect the gaps in a tatami gusoku issued to bodies of infantry. Mail could be used as a sole component, in which case it would be called a kusari gusoku, kusari meaning chain, but it was also used to make single components such as mail shirts, kusari katabira, hoods, gloves, vests, shin guards, throat protectors and socks. The rings tended to be very small. The kusari links could also be doubled or tripled. Kusari was sometimes concealed entirely between layers of cloth if discretion was needed. Generally speaking, mail in Japan was butted and not riveted, but riveted kusari was also known and used, and the Japanese manufactured it as well. It was called karakuri nanban, and it was made with stout links, each closed by a rivet, and the invention of this was credited to Fukushima Denbei Kunitaka, although it is more probable that it was derived from foreign models. In China, scale armor is one of the archaic kinds of armor. The first examples would have had leather scales fastened onto a soft leather backing or fabric, but by the time of the anterior Han dynasty, scales of copper and bronze were already produced, and scale and lamella coexisted in China all the way until the 19th century. During the later Han period, scales would also start to be produced with iron. During the Han dynasty, we had listings of armor which was used in warfare, which included the armor of thin scales, classified under the armor of iron section, and an armor made of horn scales was also mentioned. An example of Japanese scale armor is the Gyorin Kozane, or fish-type scales. Allegedly, this kind of armor was in use in Japan as far back as the Fujiwara period, or 11th century. The single scales would be cut and beaten to a convex shape to resemble fish scales and would be assembled to create individual pieces for a harness. Plate armor per se never became popular in China. The reasons for this are probably multiple. The Chinese liked the functional lamella design, which was true and tested, and didn't feel the need to change something that was, in fact, working well, and was easier and less expensive to produce. Also, the Chinese armies were state-funded armies, and depending on the dynasty and the time period, the government had to arm up huge bodies of soldiers. So arming them all up in plate would have been rather a complicated and extremely expensive endeavor. The closest armor to plate that we can find in Chinese history is called cord and plaque. During the northern and southern dynasties, this style of armor became popular. Cord and plaque armor consisted of a double breastplate and the front and back held together, sometimes on a frame, by two shoulder straps and waist cords, usually worn over the usual lamella armor for reinforcement, but it could also be worn as a standalone armor. Cord and plaque wearing figurines appear to have several types of cord and plaque armor, apparently having separated categories for light and heavy armor. The Japanese have been using armor at least since the Yayoi era, but the earliest kind of metal armor we have archaeological proof of is from the Kofun period, which were solid metal clamshell cuirasses made with riveted or laced iron plates, and they were Korean in origin. These cuirasses were lacquered against rust, similarly to later samurai armor. The name tanko, which means short armor, is now used to refer to this kind of armor, although the actual period name is unknown. Also, archaeologists tend to use tanko to refer to the Japanese designs and not to the Korean designs, and we will see what difference we have between these two shortly. The heyday of the tanko was the 4th through 6th centuries AD. The original armor that came from Korea in the 4th century was made from a series of vertical plates, or tatehagi ita, that were bound together by leather thongs, or kawatoji, and it looked similar to a lamina corset made of iron plates. During the latter half of the 4th century, a variation of this kind of cuirass started to be made in Japan that utilized large rectangular plates called hoke ita. This was genuinely a Japanese design. At this time, leather thongs were still used to lace the plates. In the 5th century, Japanese armor makers added a skeletal frame of sturdy spaced bands around the body of the cuirass that substantially improved the overall rigidity of the armor. In fact, many experts are of the opinion that cuirasses only became tanko after the skeletal frame was added to the original design. The skeletal frame consisted of several metal bands, including a wide, slightly inward angled base and an intermediate band of protective plating filling the space between the base band and the next rib. Also, horizontal bands that wrapped around the lower abdomen area of the armor were used. In the middle of the 5th century, the tanko, constructed entirely of horizontal iron plates, were joined by rounded rivets, as rivets would replace leather thongs, increasing the rigidity but reducing the flexibility of the armor. A characteristic of the cuirass is that it was shaped to the body and it rested on the hips, and the general silhouette is hourglass shaped. The chest was covered from the base of the clavicle to the top of the hips. The backplate would usually be higher than the breastplate. Due to the hourglass shape, the weight of the armor rested on the hips. Some were hinged on the side and would open in the front, while others had no hinges and would be sprung together. Cords or leather would be strung through loops on the cuirass to point it to the shoulders, as tanko had no shoulder straps. It was a prerogative of the high-status members of the Yamato people. Internal leather lining was also probable. Tosei Dogu Soku, the so-called modern armors, or armor made after 1568, are a preeminent type of Japanese plate armor. These were made from iron or steel plates called itamono, instead of individual scales called kozane. Tosei gusoku were greatly simplified and made to fit a torso better. They would taper at the waist again, providing a much better weight distribution if compared to the oyoroi. Since weight reduction was still the main priority for the samurai of this time period, together with a more solid protection against the new weapons and tactics of the period, shoulder plates were made smaller and more close-fitting and had a lower profile. Again, these were made of plate. Previous domaru and haramaki cuirasses would have each section of the cuirass hinged in 4 places. Modern plate door were instead more commonly made with a hinge on the left and tying at the right. Both yokohagi door or horizontal lames and tatehagi door or vertical lames existed among many other styles, including styles that simulated scales for cosmetic purposes. The best cuirasses of the Tosei Gusoku style were made by the Myochin family and were made of solid plates of soft iron faced with hard steel. These were a response to the new threat posed by the Tanegashima Teppo, a matchlock type arquebus made in Japan based on Portuguese examples, mass-produced and used by Japanese armies of the Sengoku era. The two metals welded together would prove to be an effective defense, as the hard steel would prevent penetration while the soft iron would bend, absorbing part of the shock. Important to mention are also the Nanban Gusoku, a kind of mixed armor based on European armor designs adapted to the Japanese taste and style, which featured morion helmets, gorgets, and late 16th century style European cuirasses, married to other Japanese components. Tokugawa Ieyasu himself owned one of these mixed European and Japanese sets of armor, which, to the Japanese eye, would have looked extravagant and exotic. Did you like this VS comparative video? Would you like to see more? And what do you prefer, Japanese armor or Chinese armor? Well, let me know in the comments below. Alright, noble ones, well I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please remember thumbs up, and if you're yet not a member of this community, become a noble one. Subscribe to my channel for more content from the Metatron. And remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye.